Well, hello everyone. My name is Farida Lindeman, and today we're going to actually talk about the importance of related industry experience on the boards of financial services firms. This is part of the corporate governance webinar series that Sustainalytics is hosting, and this is actually the second webinar that we are hosting. Before we actually get started, I just wanted to quickly go over the process of the webinar. You are, of course, welcome to ask any questions that you might have. You have this screen, and where you see number 1, you can actually type your questions. The questions will be answered as soon as we receive them or at the end of the webinar. If we don't have any time to answer them properly, we will make sure to get back to you by email so that you actually receive an answer to your question. If you click on the 2 arrows underneath number 2, you can actually make the screen a bit smaller and see the entire screen of this presentation. So today we're actually going to touch base on a few items. First, we're going to introduce the speakers and myself. I'm going to give you a short introduction to Sustainalytics. I'm also going to bring you talk you through the corporate governance research that we do at Sustainalytics, and I'm going to discuss the methodology that we're using for today's webinar. In that methodology, we will be addressing 3 key issues, and that's basically relevant industry experience for non-executive, relevant industry experience for executives, and the independence of the chairman, and related to that also relevant industry experience. We have 2 speakers today on the webinar, and they will share their experience with regards to board members and their relevant industry experience. And of course, at the end of the webinar, you are capable of answering any questions that you might have. So we're first going to do an introduction round. I will get started with myself. My name is Farida Lindeman. I'm a manager on the corporate governance team within Sustainalytics. I joined Sustainalytics in January 2015, so I've been here for almost 2 years. Before that, I worked for an asset manager in the Netherlands, based in The Hague, MN. I was working for the responsible investment team, also dealing with a lot of corporate governance related matters. And before that, I worked for a proxy advisor in Brussels, ISS. I worked there for almost 4 years to 5 years, and I was covering mainly Benelux markets there. Johan, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Farida. So my name is Johan van der Lugt, and I'm an equity analyst with Robeco's global equities team. I have some 15 years of experience looking at the financial services sector, and I've also specialized myself in governance. At Robeco, we have fully integrated ESG into the investment process, and also have the benefit of having our own subsidiary, which is called Robeco SAM, being known for one of the first in sustainability investing.
Okay, thank you, Johan. Yannick, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Farida. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Yannick Waknin, Senior ESG Analyst at Société Générale CIB. I have more than 15 years experience in the field as buy-side and sell-side ESG analyst with responsibilities ranging from sector, thematic, quant, ESG research to proxy voting. Société Générale created 10 years ago a dedicated research department to identify key ESG issues and provide relevant metrics to institutional clients with a clear objective of combining fundamental and ESG signal together. So the aim of our work toward integration of mainstream financial analysis with what we call material ESG issues. Therefore, some corporate governance practices have always been at the top of our agenda, and today focus on experience of board members is becoming even more relevant thanks to the improvement of corporate governance disclosure and transparency on the corporate side.
Okay, thank you, Yannick. What we're going to talk about next is a bit about Sustainalytics, and I just wanted to give you a short introduction on who Sustainalytics is and what it is that we do. So Sustainalytics researches ESG and corporate governance practices and turns this information into practical analysis which enable investors to make informed investment decisions. So we collect data for let's say a number of companies that we analyze, and also turn this information into a relevant analysis or practical insights that investors can use for their investment case. We're quite a global company. We currently have 14 offices globally. We have grown quite rapidly over the last 5 years. We have, for instance, a bit more than 170 analysts throughout the world, and we have a bit more than 325 employees currently. Our customers are sort of based also globally, so we have our customers are sort of spread over 22 countries worldwide, and a big chunk of that are asset managers, and part of that are also asset owners. ESG research is sort of focused on sector expertise, and so we have also gained a lot of sector expertise throughout the research that we've done on ESG related issues. And corporate governance is done from sort of a market perspective and also on a global scale. When we look at corporate governance research, we sort of focus our product on analyzing 6 key issues. The first key issue is sort of focused on board management, quality and integrity, and that's also sort of one of our topics for today's webinar. We look at the board's experience, the board members' experience, track record of board members, behavior, but also, for instance, controversies that companies have run into. We want to make sure with this key issue, we want to sort of establish whether board members are equipped to run this company properly. The second key issue deals with board structure. So we look at the structure of the board of directors or the supervisory board, and whether they provide sufficient oversight, representation and accountability to shareholders, and especially minority shareholders. So for instance, we look at tenure, but also at independence of board members, etc. The third key issue is ownership and shareholder rights, and we look at basically the ownership structure of a certain company. So is there a majority shareholder, or are shareholders sort of spread on a global scale, and are all the rights of shareholders equally divided and properly set up? Remuneration, always a very debated topic. It's also part of our key issues, and what we look at is basically the remuneration policies of all the companies that we analyze, and we sort of try to make an assessment on whether the remuneration policy actually ties the incentives to the actual performance of the company. And we also look at sort of the scale of all the remuneration setting that companies do, and also whether remuneration committees have set it up properly. Financial reporting looks at the audit committee, but also the financial reporting oversight. So the focus is on the audit committee and the external auditor, but also, for instance, whether there are any other financial reporting related controversies that the company might have run into. Stakeholder governance is sort of dealing with the management or sort of the governance of ESG related matters. So do companies management, is there any extra financial risk that sort of flows on the surface when we're looking at long-term value creation? So today we're going to sort of scope our universe in terms of the peer group banks. So we're just going to focus today on banks, and we have decided to keep that on a European scale. So all the 45 companies that we're looking at today are companies that are actually part of MSCI Europe and that are part of the banking peer group. We are going to address a few things today. We're going to sort of take a look at relevant industry experience, and we're going to do that in 2 different forms. So first we're going to take a look at experience as non-executive directors of an outside public company within the same industry. And we're going to take a look at experience as an executive at an outside company, public or private, within the same industry. So in this case, as we're talking about banks, we're looking for non-executive or executive experience at other banks. The definition of relevant industry experience is either direct experience within the same type of company, or experience within industries that are essential for the company's production as an output. Third, industries that also use the company's output are also relevant to consider in this case. We are going to take a look today at the chairman of the board of directors, and we want to make an assumption that the chairman is whether or not he's independent, and whether the chairman also has relevant outside industry experience or not. So our research sort of collects all this type of information, and we want to show what we have sort of found in terms of all this information. What we are going to take a look at today as well is tenure of all the members of the board of directors, and what we have sort of taken as a basis is we're going to evaluate tenure as of 10 years. So we're going to take a look at, let's say, board members that have tenure or of 10 years or more, and whether that affects their ability and their right to focus on let's say, the issues that are at stake for the company. So let's first get started with relevant industry experience. So if we look at executive and non-executive experience in related industries, you can see a few things. So if we look at the banking sector in Europe, 87% of the board members actually have executive experience in the financial sector. This is actually quite high, especially if you compare it to other sectors. Non-executive experience is also actually relatively high. 78% of all board members in the banking sector in Europe actually have non-executive experience in a related industry. If we look at the tenure of board members, well, like I said, we're going to take a look today at 10 years. That's basically our sort of focus. What we are looking for is basically if less than 25% of board members have over 10 years of tenure. So in this case, 60% of all the board members that we have evaluated have less than 10 years of tenure on the board. If you look at the next one, you see that the next bar, it says that 27% of the, 25% of the total of all the board members that we have evaluated, 27% of that group actually has more than 10 years of tenure on the board. When you look at the total group, you see that actually the tenure of more than 10 years for 50% of that group is actually quite low, because 0% of 50% of the board members that we have evaluated have more than 10 years of tenure on the boards that we have evaluated. I just wanted to show you an example of how this sort of looks in practice when we look at an analysis of what we have done. So for instance, I brought up a bank, Banco Bilbao Vizcaya Argentaria. So if you look at the board of directors there, you can see that it's completely dominated by executive directors of the firm. So it's also something that has a sort of an emphasis on whether or not the board members have relevant experience. Also, none of the independent non-executive directors have relevant outside experience. So in this case, the board doesn't really display any relevant outside experience, except for the executives that actually bring executive experience from this company themselves. So this is an example of a company that unfortunately doesn't have any related industry and doesn't display it as such. So we're going to actually move over to Johan, and I want him to basically talk about his experience. So Johan, could you briefly describe how you evaluate corporate governance at Robeco?
Yes, of course. I mean, corporate governance is very important for us basically throughout the entire investment process. And through corporate governance, as an investor, we get insight into the quality of management at companies. Having a high quality board that is fit for purpose is really essential, and in our opinion there are just no shortcuts in that regard. In terms of what we look for, we really look for undervalued companies that can improve their governance and can also get re-rated on the stock market. looking at the broad picture, ESG data providers can help in all stages next to the available resources that we have within our firm. Particularly I'd like to mention the governance and active ownership team that we have in-house, as well as the pool of sustainability research analysts. And in terms of the process, how it actually works, basically the first step would be in terms of screening, making sure that we weed out the bad apples. And then as a second step, we'd like to identify areas for improvement in terms of corporate governance and basically link them to financial materiality and to value creation. The next phases are all about having a dialogue with the company, which we view as essential in order to be able to assess management and board quality. Then in terms of having a window on board quality, I think you can basically distinguish three different factors. The first one would have to do with structures and procedures, and that's really the classical corporate governance framework, and think about the strength of independence and the diversity of the board. And the second thing, which is, in my opinion, a bit is not getting a lot of attention, and that's behavior of the board. And in that sense, we're looking at incidents in terms of governance and also in terms of business ethics that have come to the fore. And then lastly, in terms of performance, profitability relative to the sector and to peers, in terms of a more sustainable profit, less volatile, and ideally of a higher level. So rounding that off, and in terms of where we stand, it's important to really understand the agenda of the board, also in relation to the materiality metrics. As an investor, to know the kind of events that the company is prepared for, and to know how much time the board is actually spending on matters that basically are about the future of the company from an opportunity standpoint. So really the central question would be, does the board function well, and do they have the right competencies to bring the company forward?
Okay, thank you very much, Johan, for this. And then there's a follow-up question. What are the challenges for you of board quality in the banking sector?
Yeah, so maybe starting with a positive note, what you said in the beginning as well, since the financial crisis, the level of banking expertise and general financial expertise of non-executive directors has been rising, which is a clear positive. But then taking a different stance, I think what is noticeable is that we see a trend of regulatory bodies coming to the fore in terms of pre-improving new directors, and bank boards these days are really required to adopt a more hands-on approach as they're, as I said, closely scrutinized by supervisors. If you look at the example in Western Europe, it really seems that much emphasis is given to risk management experience and financial expertise and relevant commercial experience outside of the financial services sector. And then I'd like to talk about IT, including cyber security and things such as customer interaction and marketing. I mean, these things seem to be discounted, which is a concern for us. So therefore, maybe the question should be like, do we expect too much from company boards, and can they really be on top of the organization, and is it reasonable to expect this? If you look at the sort of increase in terms of regulation and compliance, we really see a pickup of the workload for directors. And what it results into is that if you take the US as an example, that we see an increasing trend of professional board members, and that could result in perhaps the board taking less of a challenging role, particularly if you have a CEO, chairman singularity like we have in the US as a common model. So that's clearly not something we would like to see.
Okay, thank you for this. And maybe a last question for you. Do you think that the level and extent of board renewal is on par with the degree of change that investors are expecting within the banking industry sector?
That's a great question, and I think I mean really investors they come in all shapes and sizes, and we at Robeco really take a longer term view. As I basically said in the previous question, we would like to see more technology experience on the board of banks, because this is a time in which the banking sector has to reinvent itself. So if you look at the broader environment, we are witnessing an ever-increasing complexity of the financial services landscape. Think about topics such as regulation or technological disruption, changing client demands, and the hot topics around data analytics, robo-advice, blockchain, peer-to-peer lending, and the list can be quite long. If you look at some of the data in the field, then a study by Accenture basically showed that only 6% of directors overseeing the world's biggest banks, so I'm looking a bit broader than only Europe in this regard, have any technology experience, so 6%. And almost half of the world's biggest banks have no board members with any technology experience, and this really is a key concern for us. Luckily, there are some good developments as well. Around 11% of the banks have set up technology committees on their boards. Obviously, as an investor, we would like to see that number going up. You mentioned BBVA. They actually have a committee that is addressing that, but on the downside, that committee is not fully independent, with the CEO being the chair. So that's not ideal, but at least it's a step. So in short, I think really investors should ask about the skills on the board for thinking about disruptive technology, and not only about financial sector expertise. I think we have really moved on, and we should move on. And perhaps as a related issue is the lack of a sort of forward-looking agenda. Quoting another study, this time by McKinsey, they found that directors typically spend 70%, so 70, of their time on quarterly reports and on things such as audit reviews, on budgets and compliance, and not really on the future of the company. So this is really an issue in my opinion. And as an investor, we would like to understand the focus of the discussion with the management team that the board is having, and also the degree to which the board is challenging the management team. So the core question is really, how prepared is the company really for future events, which can be both a risk but also an opportunity. And perhaps lastly, as an issue linked to this, is the self-assessment of the board and the information that's being provided to stakeholders like us. With that, and also the disclosure by the nomination committee, investors are really able to form an opinion on the requirements in terms of the skills, but also the skill gap analysis that we see, and the extent to which board members are able to meet them. So yeah, as you might expect to hear, more work is clearly needed in this regard.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you for this very valuable insight. It's very interesting to get that perspective as well. We are going to switch the topic a bit to and focus on the chairman of the board. What we're actually taking a look at is whether we have an independent chairman or not. So in this case, you can see here is that 64% of the banks that we've looked at has a non-independent chairman. So this is actually quite a high number. It could be related to different issues. It could be related to ownership. It could be a previous that the chairman has been an executive, but it could also be related to an executive chairman role, which we've also seen quite commonly in the banking industry. If you sort of combine that information with having an independent chairman and whether that actually also has related industry experience, if you combine the two, you only see that 24% of basically the banks that we've analyzed is that you have an independent chairman and also related industry experience. So you see there that the number is actually like yeah, dropping quite significantly when you sort of combine the two together. If we look at an example of this, so for instance, we can also evaluate where companies, of course, have an independent chairman. And in this case, we're looking at Swedbank, which is a Swedish bank. So independent, you have an independent chairman, and also the chairman has sort of worked at different banks and also financial institutions. Of course, a lot of the institutions are related to Swedbank, but he has also had and gained experience from outside the company throughout other companies. You see that other board members also have had or still have executive or non-executive experience in other financial institutions. So this is definitely relevant in the assessment of these companies, and also making sure that this board actually has the proper and right experience to run the company. We also wanted to sort of show an example of a company that basically that is actually involved in controversies and in which board members have limited outside industry experience. So for instance, an example here is Banco Santander. So the board of directors is 15 members large. You have four executives, and including the chairwoman, we have an executive chair. And we have 3 non-independent, non-executive directors. So of these 3 non-independent, non-executive directors, they are either family of the executive chairwoman, they have been non-independent because of tenure issues, or they have previously been a Santander executive. So there's different reasons why we've classified them as non-independent, non-executive directors. If you look at basically the entire board overall, you see that board members have limited experience in the financial sector outside of Banco Santander. So this is quite a significant. The majority of the board of directors has no experience in the financial sector outside of Banco Santander. In addition to that, the company is also involved in several business practices. Controversies. So yeah, I think that's also common to the banking industry, of course, but this is still something that we evaluated as there might be a potential link between the two. The company is involved in controversies, and there is limited industry experience present on the board of directors. What we want to actually show is what we want to talk about now is basically the perspective of Yannick in this case. Yannick, can you maybe describe how you evaluate corporate governance at Société Générale?
Oh, sure. So first of all, it's important to remind that corporate governance analysis is definitely not a box-ticking exercise. As broker, we've been publishing corporate governance research for years now, and even if we're able to demonstrate the value creation based on our selection of governance metrics with a long 10 years track record, there's still challenges for all of us ahead. First is it's about the selection of the right set of indicators, and second is probably to better understand the signal sent by the data gatherer. We've been facing in recent years a huge increase in terms of availability of governance metrics, but not only. And the issue now is being able to select the right ones. So we define our corporate governance indicators that for us could trigger a business strategy and ultimately the financial performance of a company around 4 different pillars. The first one is about board independence from the CEO vision. The second one is about the board and the shareholding structure. The third one is about compensation scheme linked to shareholder returns. And finally, talking about succession planning. So for each of those pillars, we flagged a number of metrics, including experience of the board to get the full pictures. So of course, some qualitative elements are also needed, such as business ethics controversies, AGM agenda, or pending litigation exposure, the plan being to measure the effectiveness of the corporate governance setup of companies.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe a second question for you. How do you use quantitative measure in your analysis of board quality, and how does it inform the type of questions you ask when engaging with companies then?
So of course, access to corporate governance data is improving thanks to corporates first and other stakeholder ESG rating firms. We have today more data points than ever to work on. Therefore, it is essential to rely on quantitative metrics at first. However, it's still often a preliminary step of our analysis, and I'll try to explain you why. Simply because regulators are improving corporate governance standards and transparency requirement. We can talk about, the complier explain rules, the say on pay, and so on. So we've seen a trend toward harmonization of reported data. So the challenge being now for us how to discriminate companies in this new environment. Board quality remains an essential factor for us, but the tricky part of our analysis will be to define what we consider as the right level of expertise or experience according to market cap, country, or sectors. So we need to evaluate the value added of each board members to make sure all competency are present, and to do so, engagement is often necessary to conclude to any significant risk or opportunity at company level. So we're asking questions to get the tone from the top management. We can question about, corporate culture, accountability, new regulatory risk, digitalization, as we should get the overall picture at the end of the day. So in most of our publications, including the one on the banking sectors, we divided our work into big parts. The first one is to gather information provided by the corporates, provided by ESG rating agency, and to combine that with some controversy that we could have identified in recent time. But quite often the second part of the work is to engage directly with the corporate to get extra information.
Okay, well, thank you for this. You briefly addressed quantitative data, right? So how would you use quantitative data, and what are the limits of that?
Yeah, I said quantitative data is a preliminary step to get the full pictures within large universe of stock. It is, of course, necessary because talking about hundreds of companies and bearing in mind the average data provided by each of them, we need to go through that first step. And as a result, some leaders and laggards company will be flagged kind of quickly. But most of them are showing a mixed bag of performance. So bottom line, the signal capture are about, past practices or sometimes at best present practices, but what about future practices? As analysts, this is often the question asked, from investor. Are you able to have a forward-looking views on how company will behave in the futures? And to get some ideas on that, we need to go beyond the reported information and identify issues and themes that could impact performance in the long run.
Okay, well, good to know, and also thank you for sharing this insight with us.
Thank you.
We actually reached the end of the presentation, and also all the information that we wanted to share today. So I'm actually opening it up for any questions. As I said in the beginning, you can type your questions in the question box in the GoToWebinar screen.
Sure.
In case we...
Sorry, Frida. So I have a question actually from one of the audience members. How do you evaluate, and it's directed actually at the panelists, Johan and Yannick, how do you evaluate industry experience for non-executives differently from independents? And do you feel that industry experience from non-independent non-executives is just as valuable during a board discussion as from independent directors? That's quite a mouthful, so let me know if I need to repeat that.
Well, I don't mind having a stab at that. I think at the end of the day, industry experience, relevant in the industry experience of independent board members is the most important. But it shouldn't stop there. At the end, you want to have a dynamic board where there is a diversity of backgrounds, a diversity of skills, and just the overall capability of challenging the management team. So that's really what it boils down to.
Okay, thank you, Johan. Yannick, do you have an answer?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. On my end, I will say it's important to know, individual background of each board members. But what is even more important is to get the average experience of all the different people sitting at the board. Because just going back to what the boardrooms are here for, I mean, they're here to discuss and challenge the strategy to be presented there at first place. So we need to make sure that all board members shows the right level of independent expertise, experience, and integrity all together. And this is probably where we have some role to play as investor, because it is part of our prerogative as shareholder to vote for the board members. So what I could kind of recommend is before voting for or against any nomination of board member is to look at in-depth, expertise he might bring to get, a good and right balance board.
Okay, thank you for that insight. Werner, are there any more questions?
Sure. So I have 2 more questions here. And it's not indicating for who it's at, so I'm going to wait and see who's most enthusiastic. But the first one is, aside from the financial sector, in what other sectors is board independence and experience particularly important? So that is, I think, and also in a follow-up to that, in addition to looking at experience, what are the other factors that investors should be looking at alongside the number of independent experience? So I guess that's the second one. The first one, I guess, is one for you, Farida.
Yeah, I can answer it, but I think that Yannick actually might also be quite... Yannick, would you mind answering this question? Yeah?
Of course, I will say corporate governance matters for each and every sector. I mean, as we just said, the boardroom is the place where the strategy will be presented and challenged. So this is where you should have, all the key competency together to define the right strategy for the group. So I'm not going to say that it's more important for banks than for retail companies. I will say it is as important for each and every country in each and every sectors.
Yeah, I might add to that if you take governance more broadly, then typically the financial services sector, but also the telecommunications sector and oil and gas are the sectors where governance is the most important. And if you look at the board, I mean, there's no single board. I mean, the kind of board depends upon the maturity of the company and the maturity of the industry and the kind of challenges that the board and the industry is faced with. There was a great article in the Harvard Business Review back in 2004 looking at the level of involvement and the types of boards that go with it, and you basically see that varying on a scale from a passive board and a certifying board to an engaged board, an intervening board, and an operating board. So the operating board would very much fit in with startup companies. But when you look at the European banks, we have seen a couple of situations where we really saw an intervening board coming to the fore, and I think one of those examples might be ING, where the former chairman stepped into the CEO role and basically steered the company through a new phase. And now we're back to a stage where the bulk of the European banks, I would say, is having an engaged board and not so much an intervening board anymore.
Okay, thank you both for that insight. I think that was it for the questions so far. I think if the listeners are still interested in asking any more questions, feel free to email me. My information is on this slide. You can also reach me by phone, of course. So if you have any questions afterwards, feel free to email me. That concludes me in thanking the 2 speakers for today's webinar, and also thanks to all our listeners for listening to